It was Christmas Eve, 1945, in the quiet Appalachian town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. The war had just ended, and a sense of weary relief hung in the air. Across the country, soldiers were returning home. Factories were shifting from tanks to toys, and people were daring to celebrate again. For George and Jenny Sodder, Italian immigrants who had worked for years to build a modest but comfortable life, it was a night of family, warmth, and the smell of pine needles. Their home, a two-story wooden house along Route 16, stood like a beacon against the cold winter night. Inside, the air was filled with laughter. The Sodders had 10 children in all, ranging from little Sylvia, only 2 years old, to the eldest, Marion, already working at a local store. The family's life wasn't perfect. George had strong political opinions about Mussolini and had made enemies among other Italian immigrants. But tonight, none of that mattered. The tree glimmered with handmade ornaments, popcorn garlands, and tinsel that caught the light of the crackling fireplace. Jenny had baked bread earlier that day, and the sweet, yeasty smell lingered. The younger children had gone to bed upstairs, while the older ones were still wide awake, brimming with excitement. At about 10 p.m., Marion came home from work, carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper and string. Christmas gifts for her siblings. The children tore them open eagerly. Small trinkets, toy animals, and candies. Their giggles echoed through the wooden beams. Jenny, always practical, reminded them it was late. "All right, you can stay up a bit longer," she said, "but don't forget to turn off the lights and close the curtains." It was a small moment of tenderness, the kind a mother doesn't realize will replay in her head for the rest of her life. Sometime around 10:30 p.m., George locked up the chicken coop and went to bed. He noticed the lights were still on downstairs and smiled faintly. Kids being kids. He had no idea it would be the last time he saw half his children alive. At about 12:30 a.m., Jenny was startled awake by the sound of the telephone ringing. She slipped from bed and padded to the hallway. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. "Hello," she said softly, not wanting to wake the children. On the other end was a woman's voice, cheerful, slightly slurred, laughing. "Can I speak to, I don't know, something like Rendell?" "You must have the wrong number," Jenny replied. The woman giggled strangely. In the background, Jenny could hear other voices, glasses clinking, laughter. "Oh, maybe I do," the caller said. "Merry Christmas." Then the line went dead. Jenny stood for a moment, the receiver still in her hand, unsettled. She turned off the downstairs lights, surprised to see the curtains hadn't been drawn, and noticed the front door was unlocked. Strange. Before returning to bed, she glanced toward the children's room upstairs. The faint sound of laughter drifted down. Everything seemed fine. But less than half an hour later, she woke again, this time to a sound on the roof. A heavy thud, followed by a rolling noise. Then, silence. She held her breath. Nothing more came. Shrugging it off as perhaps a branch or small animal, she drifted back to sleep. Minutes later, she smelled smoke. At first, it was faint, like the smell of a candle blown out. Then stronger, burning wood, cloth, insulation. Jenny sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. "George!" she shouted. He jumped out of bed and ran toward the hallway. Flames were already snaking up the staircase. The house was alive with fire. "Get the children!" he yelled. Jenny grabbed Sylvia from her crib and rushed outside barefoot into the cold December night. George followed, shouting the names of his children: Marion, John, George Jr., Maurice, Martha, Louis, Betty. John and George Jr., the two older boys, came stumbling from the hallway, choking on smoke. They had been sleeping in the attic, but managed to escape. Behind them, however, the stairwell collapsed into a roaring inferno. The five youngest, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 10, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, were trapped upstairs. George ran to the side of the house, desperate to climb the wall to their window. He reached for the drain pipe he'd used before to clean the gutters, but it was gone, torn off. He dashed toward his trucks, parked just feet away, intending to drive one close enough to reach the window. But neither would start. Both had been working fine the previous day. Now, the engines refused to turn over. "Jenny, the phone," he shouted. She ran inside, but the line was dead. Outside, the family screamed for help. Their neighbor, seeing the fire from her porch, tried calling the fire department, but no one answered. In 1945, the Fayetteville Fire Department didn't have a central dispatcher. Each volunteer had to call the next one in a long phone chain. It would take 7 excruciating hours before they arrived. By then, there was nothing left to save. The Sodders could only watch in horror as their home, everything they'd built, every memory, every laughter, collapsed into embers. When the flames finally died down at dawn, George and Jenny searched through the ashes with their bare hands. They found fragments of household items, bits of melted glass, pieces of their stove, but not a single trace of their 5 missing children. No bones, no remains, nothing. Jenny stared at the blackened ground, whispering over and over, "They were in there. They had to be." Yet the silence of the ashes gave no answers. The fire that had consumed the Sodder home burned out before sunrise. By morning, the cold Appalachian wind swept through what was left, a smoldering skeleton of beams and ash. The Christmas lights that had once glowed in the windows were now twisted wires, melted glass, and blackened ruin. George and Jenny stood together, numb and shaking, as the first curious neighbors arrived. Someone had called the fire department again at dawn, and finally, around 8 a.m., Fire Chief F.J. Morris and a few volunteers made their way up the narrow road. But the damage had already been done. The house was gone. The 5 children were gone. Chief Morris looked around grimly, rubbing the back of his neck. He told George there wasn't much they could do. "It's all burned to the ground," he said softly. "Nothing left to recover." George, desperate, insisted there had to be something. "Bones don't burn that fast," he argued. Morris hesitated. "Well, maybe the heat was too much. Maybe it turned everything to ash." It didn't sit right with Jenny. She knew bodies burned in house fires before, but never vanished completely. She kept glancing toward the ruins, as if her children might suddenly appear. That night, unable to bear the sight of the charred debris, George bulldozed what was left of the foundation and covered it with several feet of dirt. He said he wanted to make a memorial garden, but some later wondered if grief and exhaustion had made him act too quickly, perhaps destroying evidence that could have told them what had really happened. For a while, the official explanation seemed simple: an accidental electrical fire. But soon small inconsistencies began to surface, little things that didn't add up. A telephone repairman told George that the fire hadn't come from faulty wiring at all. In fact, the lines had been deliberately cut near the top of the utility pole. A neighbor also came forward, saying she'd seen a man stealing a block and tackle pulley from the Sodders' property shortly before the fire. That was the very same type of device used to remove a car's engine, perhaps explaining why George's trucks wouldn't start. Another man claimed he saw someone throwing balls of fire at the house that night. Suddenly, Jenny remembered the strange thud she'd heard on the roof before the fire began. She realized what it could have been: a small explosive device. The Fayetteville Fire Department didn't seem eager to investigate. They declared the fire an accident and closed the case within days. But the Sodders couldn't rest. Jenny, haunted by dreams of her children trapped in flames, began running her own experiments. She collected animal bones and burned them in her wood stove. No matter how hot the fire, they never disintegrated completely. There were always fragments left behind. So where were the bones of her children? She wrote letters to local crematoriums. One owner replied, "Bones remain, even after bodies are burned at 2,000 degrees for 2 hours. A house fire rarely reaches such heat." The conclusion was inescapable. But children could not have been completely destroyed by the fire. In the weeks that followed, the Sodders began noticing more strange details. A door-to-door insurance salesman who had visited them a few months before the fire suddenly came back to mind. He'd been angry when George refused to buy his policy. The man had shouted, "Your house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You'll be paid for the dirty remarks you've made about Mussolini." It sounded like madness then. Now it felt like a curse. George had made no secret of his hatred for Mussolini. He was outspoken among Fayetteville's small Italian-American community, many of whom still supported the dictator. There had been arguments, heated words. Could one of those men have sought revenge? By spring of 1946, the Sodders were growing desperate. They hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley to help uncover what really happened. Tinsley learned something that made the family's blood run cold. When Chief Morris had sifted through the ashes on the day after the fire, he'd supposedly found a small human heart. But instead of sending it for analysis, he placed it in a box and buried it secretly at the scene. Tinsley confronted Morris, who reluctantly admitted it. He even led them to the spot where he had hidden it. The box was dug up and sent to a pathologist in Charleston. The results were shocking. It wasn't a heart at all. It was liver tissue, and it had never been exposed to fire. Someone had deliberately planted it. As the investigation deepened, more witnesses began to emerge with eerie stories. One woman reported seeing the missing children alive the morning after the fire at a rest stop between Fayetteville and Charleston. She said she'd served them breakfast and noticed a car with Florida license plates parked outside. Another witness, a hotel clerk in Charleston, claimed she had seen 4 of the Sodder children, accompanied by 2 Italian men and 2 women, a week after the fire. The adults wouldn't allow the children to speak. Each account was impossible to verify, yet each added a chilling new layer to the mystery. Jenny and George clung to the hope that their children were alive. They began to believe the fire hadn't killed them at all, that they'd been abducted. In 1947, the Sodders took their case public. They printed flyers with the children's photos and distributed them across the United States. They even put up a billboard along Route 16 that read, "5 children missing after fire December 24th, 1945. Help us find them." The billboard became a landmark, a silent plea that stayed standing for nearly 40 years. Letters poured in from across the country. People claimed to have seen children resembling the Sodders. In Texas, in Florida, even in New York. One photo arrived in the mail with no return address. It showed a young man, about 23, with dark eyes and a strong jaw. On the back was scrawled, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Illo boys. A90132 or 90135. The Sodders were stunned. The resemblance to their missing son, Louis, was uncanny. They hired more investigators to trace the origin of the photo, but the trail went cold. No one knew who had sent it or from where. Meanwhile, strange incidents continued to haunt them. Someone told George that a group of Italian men in a nearby town had boasted about setting the fire. When he confronted them, they denied everything. The local police, fearful of stirring up trouble, refused to intervene. Years passed, and the Sodders' once bustling family life grew quiet, heavy with unspoken grief. Yet they never gave up searching. Jenny kept the porch light on every night for the rest of her life, in case her children returned. George spent years following leads across states. A rumor in Florida, a sighting in Kentucky, a letter from Canada. He mortgaged his property, traveled thousands of miles, and chased hope wherever it appeared. But the truth, like smoke, always slipped through his fingers. By 1952, nearly 7 years after the fire, the case had become a legend. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones. The official story that the fire was accidental was still the only record. But in Fayetteville, everyone had their own version. Some believed the mafia had kidnapped the children to silence George over his anti-Mussolini views. Others whispered of human trafficking or witness relocation. The deeper the Sodders dug, the darker the theories became. One rumor claimed the children had been taken to Italy itself, hidden by relatives. Another said they'd been sold to an orphanage. Still, no trace ever surfaced. No remains, no documents, no DNA. Just whispers, sightings, and grief. As the years went by, Jenny turned inward. She stopped wearing bright colors and dressed only in black. Visitors said she kept her garden immaculate, but her eyes always seemed far away, fixed on something no one else could see. George, too, aged quickly. His hair turned gray, his face lined from sleepless nights. He often stood by the site of their old home, staring at the memorial garden where the house once stood. Every Christmas Eve, they gathered what remained of their family and lit candles in the snow. And each year they asked the same question: where did our children go? The town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, was still blanketed in smoke days after Christmas morning, 1945. The charred ruins of the Sodder family home stood like a black scar against the snowy hillside. But what haunted the small town wasn't just the smell of burnt wood. It was the silence. 5 children, Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5, had vanished without a trace. When the flames died and the embers cooled, George and Jenny Sodder stood before what was left of their home. The fire had devoured everything, but something didn't make sense. In every fire, even in the most intense blazes, bones remain. Yet, in this case, there were none. No fragments, no remains, no trace that 5 young bodies had ever been there. And that was the beginning of the nightmare. Scene 1. The fire that shouldn't have been. Witnesses claimed the fire started around 1 a.m. on December 25th, 1945. Jenny woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of something crackling in the attic. She rushed to wake George, and together they ran for the stairs. But the stairwell was engulfed. Outside, snow fell softly as George gathered the children who made it out. Sylvia, the youngest at 3, Marion, the eldest daughter, and 2 boys, John and George Jr. 5 were still inside. George tried to re-enter. The ladder he always kept by the house was gone. He ran for his trucks. Both mysteriously refused to start that night. Desperately, he tried to break a window and burn his arms in the process. But the flames were already too high, too fast. In under 45 minutes, the house was gone. When the fire department finally arrived, hours later, all that remained was a smoking pit and a devastated family. Scene 2. Where are the bodies? By morning, the fire chief, F.J. Morris, began combing through the ashes, but he couldn't find any bones. None. He suggested maybe the blaze had burned so hot that it completely cremated the children. But experts later proved that theory impossible. A typical house fire reaches 1,100 degrees Fahrenheit, 600 degrees Celsius. To cremate bone, the fire needs to burn at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,100 degrees Celsius, for at least 2 hours. The Sodder home burned for less than 1. And then there was another strange detail. The appliances in the basement were still recognizable. If metal could survive the flames, why not bone? The official report, however, listed the cause as faulty wiring, and the children as presumed dead. But Jenny Sodder refused to believe it. Scene 3. The strange incidents before the fire. Weeks before the tragedy, strange things had happened around the Sodder home. A man visited, claiming to sell life insurance, But when George refused, the salesman reportedly said coldly, "Your house will go up in smoke, and your children will be destroyed. You'll pay for the dirty remarks you've made about Mussolini." You see, George Sodder was an outspoken critic of the Italian dictator. Many in the local Italian-American community still supported Mussolini, and George's public stance had earned him enemies. Another time, one of the older Sodder boys saw a car parked along the road, watching the house. The driver seemed to be observing closely, too closely. Jenny later recalled that just before Christmas, the phone rang late at night. A woman's voice asked for someone Jenny didn't know. Laughter and clinking glasses echoed in the background. Jenny hung up, confused. Minutes later, the fire began. Coincidence, maybe, but the pattern was building. Scene 4, the ladder, the trucks, the power lines. The investigation deepened. The ladder George kept by the house was found weeks later, at the bottom of an embankment, far from where it should have been. His 2 trucks, both functional the day before, refused to start the night of the fire. Later tests showed no mechanical issues, and witnesses began to surface. One woman claimed she saw the missing children inside a passing car as the fire raged behind them. Another reported seeing them days later at a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston. She remembered the children clearly, especially the youngest girl, Betty, who matched the photo in the newspaper. Scene 5. The billboard and the hope that never died. By 1952, George and Jenny had spent nearly every cent they had searching for their children. They hired private detectives, appealed to the FBI, and even erected a massive billboard along Route 16. It read, "5 children missing after fire. Help us find them." The black and white photos of the children stared out at passing cars for nearly 4 decades. The billboard became a haunting landmark, a reminder of a mystery that refused to fade. In 1968, over 20 years later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was postmarked from Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a man in his 20s and a short note that read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, IIL boys, A90132 or 35. Jenny was convinced it was her son, Louis. The same eyes, same face, but no return address, no trace of the sender. A photo reignited the family's hopes, and the investigation started again. But just as before, every trail led to nothing but shadows. Scene 6. Theories and the truth buried in ash. So what really happened to the Sodder children? There are 3 dominant theories. 1. Abduction and arson. The fire was a cover-up, set deliberately to distract from a kidnapping. The threats, the ladder's disappearance, the vehicle's sabotage, all point toward human interference. 2. Mafia retaliation. Because of George's outspoken anti-Mussolini views, the children may have been abducted by pro-fascist Italian Americans as a warning. Some say they were taken to Italy. 3. Tragic misidentification. A few believe the children really did die in the fire, and the lack of remains was due to poor recovery and cleanup. But even official fire experts doubted this explanation. Scene 7. The final years. George died in 1969, still searching. Jenny lived until 1989, never removing her mourning black veil. The family home was never rebuilt, and that billboard, weathered and fading, remained until the early 1990s, a symbol of grief that refused to surrender to time. Sylvia, the youngest Sodder child, continued to investigate the case until her death in 2021. In every interview, she repeated one line: "My mother knew they were alive. She could feel it." It was spring, 1968. The hills of Fayetteville were green again, and the air smelled faintly of new life. But inside Jenny Sodder's house, time had not moved for 23 years. The framed photographs of her missing children still lined the mantelpiece. The billboard on Route 16 still stood tall, weathered and yellow, like a scar refusing to fade. Jenny had lived every day as if her children might walk through the door at any moment. And then, one morning, a letter came. It was postmarked Central City, Kentucky. The handwriting was neat but strange, letters slightly slanted, the ink fading as if written in haste. Inside was a folded photograph of a young man in his 20s. He had dark, wavy hair, sharp cheekbones, eyes that looked like they were holding a secret. And written on the back, in block letters, was, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ill boys, A90132 or 35. Jenny's hands trembled. Louis, her son who was only 9 years old when he vanished in the fire. Could it be him? She called for her daughter Sylvia. Together, they stared at the photograph, side by side. Sylvia would later recall it was him, his eyes, even the small curl in his hair. It was Louis. But where had the letter come from? And who was Frankie? The Sodders immediately contacted a private investigator. But within days, that man vanished, taking the photograph and all information about the letter with him. It was as if the photo had come from a ghost and returned to one. Scene 1. The photograph that changed everything. Jenny couldn't stop staring at the photo. She made dozens of copies and mailed them to newspapers and investigators across the country. But nobody knew the man. Some people wrote back saying the man was a soldier. Others said he looked like a traveling salesman or a missing person from another state. But one small detail stood out. The phrase, "ill boys." For years, amateur sleuths tried to decode it. Some thought it was a code name for an organization. Others believed it stood for Italian little boys, perhaps linked to George's Italian heritage. But the truth behind those strange words remains unsolved even today. Scene 2. The FBI's silence. Back in 1947, the Sodders had already contacted J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. Hoover personally responded, writing that he would be willing to help if the local authorities permitted federal jurisdiction. But the Fayetteville Police and Fire Department refused. When the Kentucky letter arrived, 2 decades later, the family again reached out to the Bureau. This time, the FBI's response was colder. They labeled the letter as non-actionable, citing lack of evidence. The Sodders felt abandoned, first by the town, now by the government. Jenny wrote in her journal that night, "If no one will search for my children, then I will search until I draw my last breath." And she meant it. Scene 3. The Traveling. Sightings. Following the Kentucky letter, reports of the Sodder children began to resurface across the South. A woman in Houston, Texas, claimed she met a man at a bar who resembled the photo. When she mentioned the Sodder case, he turned pale and left immediately. Another letter, sent from St. Louis, said the children were living under new identities, part of a protected family, for reasons never explained. In every report, there was one theme: someone, somewhere, wanted the truth buried. But by the late 1960s, the world was moving on. The Second World War was over. America was racing to the moon, and the Sodder story had faded from headlines, surviving only in whispers. Still, the billboard remained, towering over Route 16, defying time. Scene 4. The theories that refused to die. The case became a breeding ground for theories, each darker than the last. 1. The kidnapping theory. Many believe the Sodder children were taken by someone they knew. The latter's disappearance, the cars that wouldn't start, and the quick spread of the fire, all suggested planning. It was as if someone wanted to make sure George and Jenny could never save their children. A 1950s private investigator claimed the children were adopted by Italian families in another state, possibly even smuggled into Canada. But there was no proof. 2. The government connection. Others speculated that one of George's acquaintances had ties to post-war intelligence networks. Could it be that one of the Sodder children witnessed something they shouldn't have? The theory sounds wild, but locals still whispered that Fayette County wasn't as quiet as it seemed. 3. The cover-up. Several people accused the local fire chief, F.J. Morris, of hiding evidence. Remember, he claimed he found a small heart in the ashes, then buried it secretly in a metal box at the site. Years later, that box was unearthed. Inside wasn't a heart. It was beef liver, untouched by flame. Why would a fire chief lie? To cover incompetence, or something much worse? Scene 5. The unanswered questions. After decades of searching, a mountain of questions still loomed. Why did the fire burn so fast? Why were there no remains? Who cut the power lines outside the Sodder home that night? And who sent that photo from Kentucky, if not Louis himself? Jenny often said she felt her children were watching her somehow. She left the porch light on every night, even into the 1980s. Neighbors would drive past and see the dim glow, a beacon for children who might one day return. The light never went out, not once, until Jenny passed away. Scene 6. The legacy of the billboard. The billboard became a symbol of obsession and hope. Tourists stopped to take photos. Reporters revisited the case every few years. Some mocked the Sodders, calling them the family that couldn't let go. But others admired their unshakable faith. Some define read the official story: fire due to faulty wiring. No bones found, no remains found. The children may still be alive. For almost 40 years, it stood as one of the longest-running missing person appeals in American history. When George died in 1969, Jenny took over the search. And when Jenny died in 1989, the children took her place. Sylvia, the youngest survivor, made it her life's mission to find out what really happened. In one of her final interviews, she said softly, "I remember the laughter. I remember their faces. But I don't remember a funeral. Because deep down, I never believed they died." Scene 7. The haunting silence. In the years that followed, rumors continued to spread. Some claimed to have seen the Louis from the photograph in various southern states. Others believed the children were long gone, their identities erased. No graves, no bones, no closure. Just 5 faces, frozen in time, forever missing from the Christmas morning of 1945. And so the Sodder mystery endured. A story of fire, family, and faith that refused to burn away. In the late 1940s, nearly 2 years after the fire, George and Jenny Sodder were no longer the quiet Italian-American couple who once ran a small trucking business. They had become relentless investigators, haunted, sleepless, driven by the kind of grief that transforms into obsession. By now, their home had become a shrine and a war room at once. Maps covered the walls, pins marked states and towns across the country, and folders filled with witness letters spilled off every table. Their search had taken them through Pennsylvania, Florida, Kentucky, even into Canada. But every lead, every name, eventually vanished. Until one man arrived. C. Tinsley, a local investigator from nearby Gowley Bridge. Tinsley wasn't hired. He volunteered. He had read about the case in the papers, and as he later said to friends, something about that fire just didn't smell right. Scene 1. The secrets beneath the ashes. Tinsley's first discovery was both absurd and chilling. While visiting the Fayetteville Fire Department, he overheard Chief F.J. Morris talking in hushed tones about a heart found in the ashes. When Tinsley pressed him, Morris hesitated, then confessed. He said he'd placed what he thought was a child's heart in a metal box and buried it secretly in the rubble, fearing the trauma it would cause Jenny. Tinsley was skeptical. He retrieved the box and sent it to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis. The result? It wasn't a heart at all. It was a piece of beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. Someone had deliberately planted it. Who? And why? When Tinsley returned to confront Morris, the chief denied everything, claiming he couldn't remember saying such a thing. But the damage was done. It was the first tangible proof that someone, somewhere, had gone to great lengths to stage the fire's aftermath. Scene 2. The Men in the Hills. That summer, a neighbor told George about 2 strange men seen parked along Route 16 on Christmas Eve, 1945, the night of the fire. They were reportedly sitting in a dark sedan, watching the Sodder house. Another witness, a bus driver named A.G. Dempsey, later claimed he saw fireballs being thrown onto the roof from the road. The description matched incendiary devices used in wartime, but nearly impossible to find for civilians. George began to believe the unthinkable, that someone had intentionally started the fire to destroy his family. But who would do that in rural West Virginia? Tinsley traced a rumor to a group of men who had tried to sell George life insurance weeks before the fire. When George refused, one of them reportedly said, "Your house is going up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You'll be paid for the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini." George had been outspoken against Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy, a dangerous stance at the time for Italian immigrants. Could the fire have been politically motivated, a warning, or revenge? Scene 3. The investigator who vanished. Encouraged by Tinsley's progress, George decided to hire another investigator, a private detective from Washington, D.C., whose name was never officially recorded. This man arrived in Fayetteville in 1949, stayed for a week, and promised to follow a lead in St. Louis. He was never heard from again. Letters sent to his office were returned unopened. His phone line disconnected. Even the agency he claimed to represent said they had no record of him. Jenny wrote later, "Every man who came to help us either disappeared or was silenced. It was as if the world wanted us to stop asking questions." Scene 4. The bones in the garden. In 1952, another tip arrived. A young boy, digging near the old Sodder property, unearthed a small set of bones. The family rushed to the scene, hearts pounding. For years they had lived without closure. Perhaps this was finally proof of death, or survival gone wrong. The remains were sent for analysis to the Smithsonian again. The result stunned everyone. They were human, but from a person older than any of the Sodder children, likely in their late teens or early 20s, and the soil around the bones hadn't been disturbed in at least a decade before 1945, meaning the bones had been planted there after the fire. George's voice broke as he said to a reporter, "They're playing with us. Someone's playing with us." Scene 5. The billboard and the threats. By the late 1950s, the Sodder's quest had become national news. The billboard George erected, 24 feet wide, black letters on white paint, became a roadside landmark. It showed the faces of the 5 missing children and the words, "Fire did not destroy our children. They may still be alive." Tourists stopped to stare. Reporters visited, but not everyone was pleased. George began receiving anonymous phone calls. Deep, distorted voices saying, "You'll regret it if you don't stop." One night, he found the family's mailbox smashed and the billboard slashed with a knife. Even then, he refused to back down. "If they want me to stop," he said, "they'll have to kill me first." Scene 6. The newspaper clipping. One of the strangest twists came from an old newspaper clipping mailed anonymously to the Charleston Gazette in 1956. It showed a photo of a young woman standing in front of a crowded hotel lobby, circled in red ink with a note, "This is Martha. She's alive and well in St. Louis." Martha was one of the Sodder daughters, who supposedly died in the fire. When the Sodders reached out to the paper, the editor said the envelope had no return address, and the postmark was smudged beyond recognition. George and Jenny traveled to St. Louis anyway. They found the hotel, but no trace of the woman in the photo. Another dead end. Another cruel hope extinguished. Scene 7. The disappearing records. By the 1960s, local officials wanted nothing more to do with the Sodder case. Records had gone missing. Fire reports, witness statements, even police files. When Sylvia, the youngest Sodder child, visited the Fayette County Courthouse decades later, she found that half the documents from 1945 were accidentally destroyed in a flood. But there had been no flood that year. The loss of those records was more than coincidence. It was erasure. One journalist wrote in 1967, "The Sodder case is like a mirror that reflects the darkest corners of human denial. How a small town can choose silence over truth." Scene 8. The toll of obsession. By now, George was an old man. His hair had gone white, but his eyes still carried fire. He spent every cent he had, every mile he could drive, looking for the children. He even traveled to Florida after hearing that one of his sons might be living under an alias. He came back empty-handed, but undeterred. He died in 1969, never knowing what truly happened that night. At his funeral, Jenny stood beside the casket and whispered, "We'll find them, George. I promise you we'll find them." After that, Jenny rarely left the house. She covered every window with black curtains and wore mourning clothes until her death 20 years later. But she never turned off the porch light. Not once. Scene 9. The theories resurface. Today, researchers and armchair detectives continue to analyze the Sodder case online. Modern forensic experts argue that the fire could indeed have been hot enough to destroy human remains, but only if accelerants were used. Yet the official report never mentioned any. DNA testing could have resolved the mystery, but by the time technology caught up, the evidence was long gone. Some theorists point to organized crime, suggesting George's outspoken politics crossed the wrong people. Others believe the Sodders' home may have been mistaken for another target entirely. Collateral in a feud that had nothing to do with them. But most chilling of all are the letters that never stopped. Even in the 1980s, Sylvia received postcards with phrases like, "You'll never find them," or "Forget them, they're gone." No return addresses, no explanation. Scene 10. What remains? Nearly 80 years later, the Sodder children mystery remains one of America's most haunting unsolved cases. 5 children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, vanished into a fire that left no trace. A mother who never gave up, a family who refused to forget, and a town that learned silence can burn longer than any flame. Somewhere between tragedy and conspiracy lies the truth, still buried, perhaps, in the ashes of a Christmas night long ago. The house on Route 16 no longer stood. By the late 1970s, the once bustling Sodder home, filled with laughter, with Christmas trees, with the echo of 10 children's footsteps, had been reduced to little more than a patch of overgrown land. but if you drove past it at night, you'd still see one strange thing. A single porch light glowing faintly in the dark. Jenny Sodder made sure of that. She replaced the bulbs. She paid for the electricity. She refused to let the light die, even after her husband George was gone, even when her own health began to fail. If they ever come home, she told neighbors, they'll need to see the light. It was no longer just a light for her children. It had become a symbol, a flickering testament to a mother's defiance against forgetting. Scene 1, Sylvia's inheritance. Sylvia Sodder, the youngest child, was only 2 years old when the fire happened. She grew up surrounded by grief, conspiracy, and whispers she didn't fully understand. As she grew older, she became the family's memory keeper, inheriting every photograph, every newspaper clipping, every unanswered letter. When Jenny passed away in 1989, Sylvia promised her, "I'll never stop looking, Mama. Not until I know." For decades, Sylvia tried to reopen the investigation. She contacted police departments, forensic experts, even television producers. Most politely declined. Some didn't even reply. But Sylvia never stopped talking. She gave interviews, spoke at schools, and kept the story alive on community radio stations. And then the internet found her. Scene 2, the case goes digital. In the early 2000s, the Sodder children mystery became one of the first true crime stories to gain traction online. Forums like Web Sleuths and later Reddit began dissecting every detail of the case, reanalyzing maps, timelines, fire temperatures, even handwriting on the mysterious photograph mailed in 1967. New digital investigators began emerging. People with no connection to the Sodder family, but with an obsession eerily similar to George's. They analyzed shadows in photos, tracked down descendants of witnesses, even tried AI reconstructions of the children's faces. Some claimed to have found matches in Texas, in Florida, in New York, but none were ever verified. Still, every new lead reignited the fire. And every time, Sylvia's family would say, "We'll check, we owe them that much." Scene 3, the 1967 photograph, A Final Hope. Let's go back for a moment to that strange photo George and Jenny received in the mail in 1967. It showed a young man, about 25, with dark eyes, slicked hair, and an almost defiant half-smile. On the back in neat block letters was written, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Ill boys, A90132 or 35. The handwriting didn't match anyone in the family. The code, A90132 or 35, has never been deciphered. After George's death, Jenny framed the photograph and hung it on her living room wall. She would often sit in her rocking chair, staring at it for hours. Some nights she'd whisper, "Is that really you, Louis?" In later years, digital analysts enhanced the image and compared it to childhood photos of Louis Sodder. The resemblance was uncanny, near perfect, but with no physical remains, no DNA. There could never be proof. To this day, the photo remains one of the most chilling artifacts in true crime history. A snapshot frozen between hope and horror. Scene 4. What the Fire Couldn't Burn. By the 1990s, journalists began to revisit the story. Television documentaries, podcasts, and magazine features all tried to solve the mystery anew. Experts debated the science. Could 5 bodies truly vanish in a house fire without leaving bones, teeth, or traces of calcium? The answer, repeatedly, was no. Even crematoriums, where temperatures exceed 1,400 degrees Celsius, leave fragments. The Sodder fire lasted only 45 minutes. And so the scientific consensus leaned toward what George had believed all along. The fire didn't destroy them. Something or someone took them. Scene 5, the Louis sighting. In 2005, an independent researcher named Jennifer Valenti, a pseudonym used online, published an investigative blog claiming she had traced the man in Kentucky who matched the photo's face almost exactly. He lived quietly under another name and refused all interviews. When she reached his doorstep, she said an elderly woman opened the door and told her, "You people need to stop asking about that boy. He doesn't belong to you." Days later, the blog was deleted. Jennifer disappeared from public view. No one has ever confirmed whether her story was true or an elaborate hoax. But the rumor spread. It reignited global fascination. Once again, the Sodder fire burned online. Scene 6, Family of Ghosts. Sylvia passed away in 2021 at the age of 79. Her children say she never stopped wondering, never stopped turning on a porch light every Christmas Eve. Today, her descendants maintain a small online archive, sodderchildren.com, preserving every article, photograph, and handwritten note. They call it the House of Light. Each year, on Christmas night, dozens of people from Fayetteville and beyond light a candle in memory of the Sodder children, not out of pity, but as a ritual of remembrance. Scene 7, the modern theories. Theories still divide researchers. 1. The kidnapping theory. That the children were taken by someone the family knew. Perhaps distant relatives from Italy, and smuggled abroad to punish George for his anti-fascist views. Supporting evidence, sightings in Florida. A woman who claimed she saw the children with Italian-looking men at a diner the next morning. 2. The insurance agent revenge theory. The man who threatened George could have been part of a local network with political ties. Motive: to silence a loud voice in a small immigrant town. 3. The mistaken identity theory. Some researchers believe the fire was meant for another target, possibly someone hiding near the Sodder property during wartime surveillance. 4. The cover-up theory. Perhaps the fire chief, the local police, and town officials all knew the truth, but buried it to protect someone powerful or connected. Every theory leads to the same unsolved riddle. If the children weren't in the fire, where did they go? Scene 8, the endless light. In 2023, a drone pilot filmed the site of the old Sodder home. The land is quiet now. A patch of grass beside an empty stretch of highway. But when the footage was enhanced, one faint, warm glow appeared in the lower left corner of the screen. A small solar lamp, left there by an anonymous visitor, and beside it, a note for the 5 who never came home. The Sodder mystery endures not because of its darkness, but because of its light, the stubborn, impossible hope that somewhere, somehow, truth can still be found. Maybe they died in that fire. Maybe they escaped and built new lives far away. Or maybe the truth was buried with the people who wanted it forgotten. But every Christmas Eve on a quiet road in West Virginia, there's still a light that refuses to fade, a promise that even after 80 years, some mysteries never burn out.